Hello everyone, my name is Tadej and welcome back to another episode of the Ivory Tower. Today I'm delighted to be joined by Professor Daniel Mügge, Professor of Political Arithmetic at the University of Amsterdam, where he leads groundbreaking research into the European Union's governance of artificial intelligence through the RegulAite project. Daniel combines scholarship with practice. He co-founded the AI and Politics platform at UvA and actively shapes key policy discussions in Brussels. His influential work on AI sovereignty reveals how technology is becoming the new battleground for global influence. Now, I first met Daniel 3 years ago at the very first introductory lecture on political science at UvA. And this year I had the pleasure of taking his insightful course on politics and artificial intelligence. It's exciting now to have the opportunity to dive deeper into all of these topics with you. So Daniel, welcome.
Yeah, hi.
It's great to have you here. To start off, I would like to get the basics straight. What is AI?
AI, I think, is two different things. On the one hand, AI is, at best, a vague, blurry at the margins cluster of technologies, basically algorithms that have the distinguishing feature that they evolve over time, and in the sense that they can learn, that they can adapt to additional input that comes in. And that, for me, distinguishes them somewhat from, say, other very complicated but essentially pre-programmed algorithms. Mm-hmm. And I think the other thing that AI is, and that's very important not to forget, is like this idea that just hovers above societies, hovers above politics, that's super influential, where people go like, wow, there's AI, it's called artificial intelligence, it's going to do something to the world. And this idea, the fact that we call these technologies AI, artificial intelligence, is very powerful in and of itself. If we had called the same cluster of technology something else, I think we'd be in a very different place.
But it's not really a new thing, is it? I mean, it's very trendy right now. Everywhere, headlines, right?
Yeah, I think that's right. The term AI has been around since the 1950s, when it was basically, pronounced as something that computer scientists might want to strive towards, create something that they then called, let's maybe call this thing AI that we're building here. But for a relatively long time, it basically lived a sort of shadow existence, and most people didn't really pay much attention to it. And I think that has to do with the fact that these technologies hadn't quite ripened yet. And what that means in particular is that they hadn't really become commercially exploitable. I think the moment AI burst onto the scene was when the technologies were ripe enough that big money, and that was sometimes big government money, but mostly big corporate money, was ready to flow in and say, okay, we can make money with this stuff. And they sure did.
Okay, we'll definitely come back to that aspect of commercial side of AI. But as you said, AI is this cluster of many things. And many of them, they seem very smart, right? Be it chatting, creating arts, writing codes. Are they actually thinking? Or how does AI work?
I think that depends a little bit on the kind of AI that we're talking about. I think most people these days say AI to them and they think of something like ChatGPT, right? These large language models, as we call them, I think are the most popular and also most visible kinds of technology here. And originally, what these things would do is that they would try to identify complex patterns in text. So, for example, trying to see whether particular words would systematically be followed by other words, but then also trying to understand, say, the context around that. So, for example, if you have a word like orange, for example, that could refer both to the fruit, the thing that you can eat, but also to the color. And so when you have a chatbot and you type a prompt into ChatGPT that has something to do with orange, then somehow that system will need to pick up through other clues that are hidden somewhere else in the sentence, for example, the word eat, that you're actually talking about the fruit and not about the color. So what you get is an algorithm, so a software program, that by looking at and looking again at and looking yet again at large amounts of text starts to pick out these relatively complicated patterns of words, and then in response to a prompt that you type into something like ChatGPT is able to reproduce and also recombine the different patterns that it has learned and give you an answer that seems like an appropriate as an likely response to what you've typed in.
But then would you say it's original, or is it just reproducing everything that's been said already?
I mean, that's of course a question that you can ask about many things, right? I mean, the conversation that we're having right here, like how original is that, or to what degree?
Used already.
yeah, right. You know, like, or to what
Fair
degree are we just recombining stuff that we've read, that we've heard, that we've thought about before, that other people have thought about? So I think it hangs somewhere in between, in the sense that can an AI system produce new combinations of words, new text, new content, new music that in that way has never been around before? Yes, it can, right? In that sense, it makes something that hasn't existed in that form. Is it to what degree are these products, as it were, or is the content that's produced is like out of the box, like something original, like we've never seen something like this before? Mm-hmm. Well, that may be slightly less so, but to be honest, like I'm less worried about whether it's just like rehashing stuff, because I think most of us do that most of the time, versus like being truly original, and more by the question of how do these systems, which are pretty powerful and pretty good at what they're doing, how do they affect our ability to make new and original stuff and to flourish and things? So I think these systems, like they're not magic, but they're pretty good. And for the moment, like that does a trick for me.
Okay. Actually, I want to turn to your personal side, because you're not a software engineer, nor are you a data scientist. You're a professor of political arithmetic, studying politics. What got you interested in the field of AI in the first place?
Yeah. So before I studied AI, I was busy with the hidden politics of things that look pretty technical. Like that's the red line that runs through my work throughout the past, 2.5 decades. Started out with studying finance, financial regulation, accounting standards, so pretty technical things that certainly in the context of the global financial crisis became super political. Then I felt I had sort of like said everything that I wanted to say about the global financial crisis, as had many other people, and moved from accounting for banks to accounting for national economies, to accounting for our economies as a whole. Mm-hmm. So it's basically studying the political underbelly of economic statistics. That's where the political arithmetic comes in, because when government statistics were sort of invented in the 17th century, the guy who was mostly responsible for that, William Petty, he needed like a label to sell his new invention, to peddle it to governments, to kings effectively, and he called it political arithmetic. So it's like the studying of this political underbelly of statistics that actually provided the name for my professorial chair here, political arithmetic. Fast forward a little bit, and I start reading more and more about AI in newspapers. And what I started to notice is that there were like a few topics that I came across in the news that felt, that really gave me goosebumps a little bit, where I was like, oh, this could be really great, but it could also be like a real problem for humanity in the 21st century. And those two things were climate change and AI. And I felt, well, as somebody who has the luxury of being well paid, having a secure position at a university, and I get the liberty to like study stuff and hopefully study stuff that somehow is, relevant to the people around me. Like in a way, like I don't want to waste my time. Also because other people pay with their money for me being able to do this. Yep. And because there were a lot of people studying the politics of climate change and potential climate collapse already, I felt, well, in that case, then maybe the other thing that feels like really urgent and important to me should become the focus of my work, and that was AI.
Okay. And what role does politics play in AI? I know it's a broad question.
But it's an important question, because I think most people, when they think of somebody studying or researching AI, they don't think of people who do politics or study politics. So I'm glad you asked that question. I think politics comes in basically on two different ends. So on the one hand, and that's maybe the more obvious one, many of the effects that AI has or AI technologies have in the plural are political. They benefit some people and they disadvantage others. So for example, they may end up making some people extremely rich, but also kill other people's job. They may end up making some jobs a lot nicer and maybe increase wages there, but also dumb down other jobs, meaning that people get less life satisfaction out of them because they become the extended arm of an algorithm. These algorithms may end up discriminating people if they're widely being used. AI is used in warfare, so on and so forth. So there's many political sides to what people do or don't do with AI. That's the one side. The other side is that the AI that we have and the AI that's being developed is itself shaped by the economic and political conditions that surround us. So from the get-go, governments have been interested and continue to be interested in how these technologies are developed, who develops them, who gets access to them, who doesn't get access to them, because they're interested in the military applications of these things, because they think that that's something that can make their countries rich and get them ahead internationally, because they want these technologies maybe to save money in public administration.
Yep.
Somebody like Elon Musk goes around and says, we can, fire all these public sector workers because you can use as in Elon Musk's AI, and then we can automate this whole thing, but also to control and survey populations through, say, facial recognition technology, or like keeping tabs on them through, security services and stuff. So governments have been in this game from the very beginning as well. This is not a neutral technology that like a meteor comes from outer space and all of a sudden hits us. We're like, oh, interesting, new technology. What should we do with this? But it's grown out of a seedbed of the pretty unequal political and economic conditions in which we find ourselves. And also in that way, AI is political.
So then would you say AI threatens democracy?
I think it can, right? I mean, AI never does something by itself, but it depends on who uses it, to what ends, and also what kind of AI has been developed and has been made available. Having said that, I think there are many ways in which it is a threat. It's a threat in the kinds of ways that I think people have talked about a fair bit. For example, using AI to disseminate and create disinformation, misinformation, basically to clog our information channels, either with crap or with stuff that's consciously misleading. That, I think, is a threat to democracy. It's also a threat, potentially, when it creates conditions that make many people unhappy, that could go through job markets, for example, but that could also go to, say, the effects that it has on mental health of people, right? If we constantly look at our mobile phone screens and see stuff that makes us angry or frustrated or simply overwhelms us, I think, those are things that contribute to people, feeling a form of discontent that may then maybe translate into pretty radical political decisions at the ballot booth, right? So also in that way, I think it's, so it's not necessary that AI on its own does that, but I think it can be part of a mix that destructs rather than aids or boosts or supports democratic tendencies in countries.
So it's not AI, it's how we use AI.
I think so, right? Because you could imagine that, say, for example, just mentioned something like social media companies using AI, and there's been a lot of debate about, for example, the use of algorithms that maximize engagement by users of social media, right? So to glue them to the screen because they get all excited and get all this adrenaline in their blood. That's something that could be switched on or off, or it could be selectively used to boost certain kinds of content. Having said that, I think it is also important to recognize that there are some inherent features to at least some of these technologies. So algorithms that can be used, say, by powerful companies to understand our personal behavior better. If a powerful company or a powerful government has that technology to understand me better, and like they want to use me for something, to earn money or to push politics left, right, or wherever, then that in and of itself sounds potentially dangerous to me.
Yeah, absolutely. If we were to take big companies, governments, maybe some other players, who would you say has upper hand in steering AI development right now? Who is in control?
So I think I'm more comfortable with the first version of the question. So who has the upper hand in this, right? Because I wonder whether there is somebody who's in control, and actually think that part of the problem is that nobody's really in control right now, even though some people or some organizations have the upper hand. So I think the development that we've seen is that, at least that's the idea or the hope, that AI has become very attractive commercially, so that companies have identified this as an enormous potential source of income and of revenues. Again, maybe it's something that we come back to in a moment, how that has exactly played out so far. And since then, big corporate money has moved into AI development, and in particular, big legacy tech companies, if you will, so the Microsofts, Googles, Amazons of this world, companies that have actually been around for a while. You know, they're not new companies. I mean, Microsoft is roughly half a century old. This is pretty old stuff. Right. They have used their enormous resources to move into this field, to buy nascent players or to somehow co-opt them into their businesses, as has happened with OpenAI, and sort of, you know, boost what happens there. Right now, that means that I think that these companies themselves are at the forefront of developing the most powerful AI, and they also control a lot of the resources. Now, the same thing has happened not only in the United States, but also in China, where United States' fear of China becoming an important geopolitical competitor has led them to try to cut China off from access to certain basically American-made or American-controlled or American-designed digital technologies. The response has been by the Chinese to say, well, in that case, we have to build them ourselves, which they did, successfully so, a lot faster than people thought. And so now you have this bipolar situation where you have two clear global leaders in AI, the United States and China. Everybody else is somewhere else, but certainly not near the top. And the competition between these two, for better or worse, structures a climate and creates a climate in which both sides feel that they can't afford to slow down. So it's this dual bipolar race in which they're locked, where nobody feels that they're actually in charge. Everybody is afraid that they'll lose control, that is responsible for companies pushing ahead as much as they can and also having governmental license to push ahead as fast as they can.
So is this AI race between countries? And where would you position Europe in all of this?
Well, so it's certainly not near the top. I think the Europeans think of themselves as like a potential third pole in this. And I think there are two very different ways of thinking about this. On the one hand, if we really think of cutting-edge AI, so like the most powerful large language models, right, which by now go a lot further than just generating text, right? They're meant to be able to reason about relatively complex things, and whether they really reason or whether this is just like weird algorithmic output doesn't quite matter that much. Like the output that they generate is pretty good. Yeah. When it comes to this sort of stuff, there's only two big players right now: U.S., China, and Europe is nowhere to be seen. Period. Having said that, a lot of the economic benefit of AI is likely to lie in being able to apply these kinds of technologies, and also technologies that are not so much cutting edge, but by now relatively commodified forms of AI throughout your economy, right? So if you want to automate a certain part of your logistics, you don't need an AI model that costs billions of dollars to build and run or something. You can use something that's relatively basic, and if you have a few smart people that can integrate that into your logistics operation, you're fine. You can boost your productivity. So reaping the economic fruits of these digital technologies is a completely different story than being one of the leaders in the development of these technologies. And when it comes to that, integrating AI successfully into your societies and economies while avoiding the downside, something we may get to, then Europe actually may be well placed to become a solid and successful place that embraces these kinds of technologies and builds them into their own societies and economies.
Yeah, but with this comes regulations, and I want to talk about that a bit more. But first, I want to bring back the topic of commercial side of AI, because as you said, a lot of companies are pouring a lot of money into AI development. Obviously, they have some aim, some goal at their mind. What are the risks that we should be, looking for in all of this?
Yeah, intuitively, I think there are three different types of risks that we need to be concerned about when this money flows, relatively full throttle into these kinds of technologies. The first one is that there are many what you could think of as collateral damages that widespread application of these technologies can do that I think right now we don't have on our radar screen. That concerns, for example, algorithms that contain biases, that have the effect that some people don't even get invited for job interviews, that some people don't have access to welfare state benefits, that people are systematically discriminated against at airports or something. But they also have side effects such as, we talked about this before briefly, that we have highly addictive algorithms in our social media feeds that distract or aggravate people, that affect the mental health of young people. We also have side effects such as that maybe people have less and less of an incentive to develop certain kinds of human qualities that we would normally think are really worthwhile and that we would like to encourage in each other. So there's a lot of societal side effects that if we just push ahead with commercial development, remain unregulated, and that may do real damage. That's number one. Number two is the environmental impact of a lot of this. So certainly the very large data centers consume huge amounts of energy, like electricity usage is enormous, and it's reached for countries that develop a lot of this, so the United States and China, but true elsewhere as well. It's really become a non-trivial factor in global CO2 emissions. And that happens while we're almost sure to blow through the 1.5 centigrade global warming goals that we had set at some point. And I think that's a real risk. And again, if nobody's willing to slam the brakes on this stuff and say we need to develop this, if we develop it in a much more sustainable way, then we have a problem there. The third kind of risk has a very different quality. So for a while now, some people from this tech circuit have been talking about what they call existential risk. The idea there is that it's conceivable, at least, that an artificial intelligence system, so again, think of something like a very good ChatGPT, that it could reach a level of intelligence and proficiency that it would become so good that it would, out of its own capabilities, start to pose a threat to humanity. So, for example, that you would start having an algorithm that can deceive other people about its true intentions, that it somehow set a goal that would, from then on in, make it pretend that it's on our side and it's just, in a very friendly and pliant manner answering all the questions that we have, but is in the background scheming about what its true intentions are. And in smaller experiments that people have done, if you take very capable large language models, there have been a number of examples where these things have been deceptive. So you give them a task, say, try to do this and that, even though it's not allowed, and try to figure out a way how to do that. And it turned out that these models were perfectly capable of devising strategies that involved deceiving people about what they were actually up to, right? And that's, of course, the thing with deceiving people is that you don't know whether they're doing that until it's too late, right? So there you could actually see it happen. This is game playing strategies, for example, where they come up with stuff, they don't play by the rules, but they somehow change the rules, but nobody really noticing. So the fear there is that we end up with systems that are super capable, as it were, and that could be a game changer because they could start doing stuff that is really a threat, and we might not be able to know how to stop them because before they start doing whatever nefarious thing it is that they want to be doing, they have devised a strategy also to disable all our countermeasures. Or alternatively, that's a slightly less extreme but still potentially worrying scenario. The question is, what would happen if, again, we have a super capable system that's smarter than any human out there? To what degree would all of a sudden, say, so many jobs that right now are out there that still rely on humans' cognitive capabilities immediately become obsolete, right? If all of us, if there is an AI that could have as much smarter conversation about this than you and I, then why would we still be sitting here?
What are we doing here?
What are we doing here? I think we should be sitting here, but for some people, that's a real threat, and they say it's coming and it's coming soon.
Yeah, it's very scary.
It is, yeah.
It is scary, and for us not to, to make sure it doesn't overtake us, doesn't ride over the human agency and everything, there should be some regulations put into place. You looked closely at how the EU is trying to regulate AI and wrote papers on this topic. What's your take on the approach EU is taking right now?
I think it's a good step in the right direction because I agree with the intuition that you just articulated. Like, we do need some kind of regulation. If we want these technologies, and I think that's true for many technologies, if you want them to serve broadly conceived the public interest, whatever exactly that is, then that needs public, as in government, guidance.
Yep.
If you leave these technologies in the hands of the most powerful corporations and let them do with these technologies whatever they want, then you end up with something else, but not something that serves the public interest. So from that perspective, regulation is definitely necessary. When it comes to what the EU does, I think there are two good things, but there's other things that are still lacking. So the first good thing is that it says, there are a few kinds of uses to which you can only put AI systems if you've really checked that they don't have negative side effects. So, for example, if you want to use an AI system to sort through CVs that have been submitted in the context of a job vacancy or something like that, you got to make sure that the algorithm you use doesn't discriminate. Something like that, right? And there's a whole range of things. You want them to be fair. You want, if possible, them to be somewhat transparent. And you have a range of these things. Good. That's meaningful. The other thing is also that these extremely large AI models, again, think of something like ChatGPT, that can be used for all sorts of things, and we don't quite know yet what people will eventually do with them, that the companies that develop these super powerful AI models, that even before they put them on the market, the EU has said, you need to test them for potential risks that they may entail. That also strikes me as plausible, because otherwise you might be too late. So even before you roll this stuff out, you gotta test it. That seems a reasonable thing. But I think what people in Brussels have found, and a little bit, or maybe a little bit to their surprise, a nasty surprise, is that there's a big difference between writing into law, thou shalt not discriminate, or thou shalt safety test, and actually making that work in practice. Right? That's a very, very, very different thing. And because the definition of, what exactly counts as discrimination is super thorny. Implementing that in a legally robust, technically feasible way, it is no mean thing. So, politicians come out and they say, we have an agreement. We have decided that in the future we don't want AI discrimination.
Great.
You're like,
everyone collapsed.
Exactly.
We succeeded.
Exactly. Uncork the champagne and people go like, oh yeah, cool. So, like the politicians have decided that. It's good that they've decided yet, but it doesn't mean that the problem is thereby solved. And to the degree that these technologies become more and more capable at an extremely quick pace, and also become more and more complex, there is a real difficulty, or maybe even impossibility, of the legal constraints that we want to set in place to keep up with the technological developments. And that's a challenge that I think, right now nobody has really solved yet. People seem unwilling to say, well, maybe in case of doubt, then, more often than not, we might simply have to say, well, you can't use this thing.
Yeah.
If you don't feel confident, say, for example, that a certain algorithm is bias-free, then you, University of Amsterdam or whoever, you can't use this to sift through CVs of applicants or what have you not or something. So I think the impulse is right. We're finding out as we speak that implementing, enforcing, operationalizing these things is a lot more thorny than we would have hoped. What the answer to those difficulties is, I think, is right now still unclear.
But do you think theoretically it's possible to even keep all of these companies accountable? Because we're talking about billion-dollar, huge corporations who have huge interest in, collecting all of this data. And all of that.
So I think it's difficult, but for me, the bigger difficulty is not how large these corporations are. I think that's a political problem, one of political will, and I think that's important. But for me, it's more an artifact of the properties of the technology itself. So if you have, say, refrigerators, household appliances, at some point, people discovered that the chemicals that were used in refrigerators were depleting the ozone layer, and that was, a serious problem for humans, for the environment, for everything. And so they said, okay, we need to get rid of these chemicals, can't have them in the refrigerators anymore. And, that was something that was relatively easy to decide. The rule was very clear: thou shalt not use these things in your refrigerators. And it was also relatively easy to monitor whether they would actually implement that. And, these were also pretty large companies, like maybe not as big as Microsoft, but like Bosch or Haier or what have you not. But, they could pull that off. They could say, okay, this is it. And within a few years, these things were phased out and, the ozone layer is recovering. With AI, that's so much more difficult because what exactly it is that you need to do is often relatively vaguely defined. What that is. There's a lot of legal uncertainty. Monitoring these things, who's developing what, whether there aren't spin-off products sitting on somebody's hard drive that do this, that other things don't. So I think it's not only a question of who's big and who's small. That's also a problem. But even if we had like a lot of smaller players, in some ways you would think that might make it even more difficult to enforce these things, right? If you have only 4 companies dominating the scene and you have like a real understanding with them of what it is that they have or don't have to do, and you can monitor that, and the 4 between of them also know, okay, everybody else is playing by the rules, so we also play by the rules, and there we go. That's easier than if you have 400 of these companies. You got to check them all.
Right.
And if there's only 1 or 2 companies that don't play by the rules, then you still have a problem in the end.
From your time in Brussels, because you spent some time there, you get to speak to people who work on these regulations that we talk about. Is there anything they're getting wrong? Or something that surprises you about some decisions they make, approaches they take?
So for a few years now, there has been a lot of talk about the AI hype, right? That AI is everywhere. It's the technology that will change everything, that it will be decisive for the future prosperity or downfall of countries and the like. And my impression is that too many people in Brussels have bought too much into this AI hype. Mm-hmm. And the consequence has been that there has been serious FOMO, fear of missing out, in the sense that policymakers in Brussels felt if they don't also somehow ride this AI wave, then they'll be lost, and economic prosperity in Europe will shrivel, and we won't be anywhere. And that, I think, is wrong. On the one hand, I think our future prosperity, but also the cohesion of our societies, and thereby whether we can safeguard democracy, and that's not a given these days, doesn't depend so much on whether or not we implement AI, but whether we use the resources and the riches that we already have in a productive and equitable manner such that it sustains people individually and societies as a whole. This continent is rich enough to sustain itself and to make its people happy. The future happiness of European people doesn't depend on AI. It depends on other things. Yeah. And so in that sense, sometimes it feels that that's actually a big distraction, that people feel like, oh, the future of Europe depends on AI. No, the future of Europe also depends on whether we can keep proto-fascist parties at bay, which are cropping up everywhere. Yeah. It depends on whether we can stand together while there is a serious onslaught from different sides in terms of global trade conflicts. It depends on whether we can finally get our act together and, make sure that if we can't ensure, or if we can completely avoid drastic climate change, that we can at least safeguard the future of present and future generations in terms of being able to live safely on the land and close to potentially rising sea levels and these sorts of things. There are so many other things that matter, I think, are much more urgent, that it feels a little bit like a distraction. And so in that sense, I feel that we also need to build and boost our AI in the name of global competitiveness, because otherwise we simply lose out in this global race. That's a misguided panic that is too dominant in Brussels, and there's too little level-headedness that goes if these other countries, if they want to race with that, let them race with that, let them partially waste their resources on this. Let us simply make sure that we do our homework and sustain the many valuable things that this continent has built already.
So it's really this mindset of AI race that You gotta be there. You gotta chase up America, chase up China.
I think so. I think, there are definitely good things that you can do with these technologies.
Yeah.
No doubt about that. But they're also seriously either useless or positively bad things that you can do with them. Many of the companies that invest most of the money in these technologies are sort of like big tech companies. So take a company like Meta, for example, which is an advertising company, right? It uses social media channels to sell advertising. That's the business model.
Right.
So it's not a social media company, it's an advertising company. That's what it does. If Mark Zuckerberg, the CEO of Meta, says that his company will yet again invest billions and billions of dollars to build better, stronger, faster, more comprehensive AI systems, then he does that in order to improve, that is, to make even more manipulative, the advertising technologies that he controls there. Now, that is money where I feel like that is not spent in a way that's beneficial for society.
Yeah.
If Europe doesn't have its own Meta, if these billions of dollars that are spent in the US on manipulating people more effectively, if they're not being spent in Europe, that's not a loss to European societies. That's good news for European societies. And there are many more of these things where you're like, well, nobody needs that. It doesn't make anybody happier. Let's focus on the 20% of AI that actually make people happier. Let's throw our money at that. Great stuff, by all means. But the other 80%, you can not only safely ignore, you can actually be happy that you don't have them in your midst.
Yeah. And if we were to look at US, when J.D. Vance came to a Munich conference, his famous speech about us Europeans being frightened, not being ready for this great new future of technologies. What do you make of all of this?
So I think there are two things going on here. I mean, as I told you at the very beginning, I'm frightened as well, because I think there are simply many things that wouldn't be good for societies if they were simply rolled out freely. So I don't think that that's a bad thing. I mean, I don't think it's a bad thing to be frightened of climate collapse. I wish more people would be frightened of climate collapse. I think that,
Unless you're a billionaire.
Maybe. Even then. So, right. Which I certainly am not, and rumor has it, most other people aren't either. So I think I wish more people were more frightened of this, right? It doesn't mean panicking, but it means, being level-headed and looking in the eye stuff that the future doesn't always hold great things, and I think that's something that we're finding out these days. Maybe 20 years ago, people were like, "Oh yeah, the future, cool, that's going to be nice." Here in 2025, you're like, "Yeah, maybe not," right? I mean, I think many people have found that out. But the other thing also is that from the American perspective, and that's the bit that I get, from the American perspective, now even more so than 5 and certainly 10 years ago, the central axis around which global politics revolves is bipolar competition with China. The Europeans, I mean, we found that out now under the new Trump administration, but it was also already true before. The Europeans, from a Washington perspective, are a relative sideshow. They're interesting as a potential partner in this global bipolar struggle, but in and of itself, they're like a secondary concern.
Not a big fish.
No, they're certainly not as big as the big fish that's out there, China, right? And so if the Americans have, over time now, decided that for them, the primary prism through which to look at this AI technology is this bipolar competition with China, plus potentials like the internal money-making opportunities. But I think this Sino-American competition is really big there. Then I can understand that they feel that they're in a completely different situation than the Europeans. Like these are two different games that they're playing in this AI realm. For us Europeans, we're like, those concerns that the Americans have, we don't have them, and vice versa.
Okay. Yeah, I can definitely see that. Now turning back to democracy, now that we touched on regulations, do you think we can expect a new form of democracy to emerge from this AI?
It strikes me as unlikely. And it strikes me as unlikely because I think it tends to underestimate, say, the human factor in how societies tick. I think many scientists, social scientists, political scientists, but also computer scientists, people who live very much in their heads, as it were, that they've developed visions of the future where somehow like they've taken the human factor out. They've designed societies, they've imagined future societies that are, I don't know, like the Jetsons or whatever, but somehow, these societies that they imagined, whether they're great or not so great, were sort of like conspicuously devoid of like real normal people who do normal stuff, like who watch Netflix, I don't know, who go for a run in the morning or maybe not, but also who are forced to work in sweatshops, who haven't make love, who die, who grieve, who are bored, who get angry, like all this, like the basic human stuff. And so I think when it comes to political developments and the way that these things pan out, I think there's a lot of human resistance and inertia to these things. So we, for example, earlier talked about how difficult it is to get, in my book at least, enough people scared enough of potential climate collapse, right? In my head, I would think like, okay, how is that possible, right? And maybe I'm too much of a person who is in their head themselves, but I'm thinking like, okay, here's the evidence. Okay, we need to change our ways. But people, like, they keep doing their thing, they keep consuming the way they've been consuming. It's really astounding and in some ways sobering to me that that's the case. But this is a form of, sort of like of human inertia, human resistance to big new designs. And some of these designs are great and I would like them. Others I think are pretty horrible or something, but there seems to be this resistance there. And that also means for me, getting back to your question, whether we should expect sort of like a new form of democracy. I think what we'll get is that these AI technologies have different kinds of impacts on how democracy functions. But I don't think what we'll see is the emergence of sort of like a new form, but rather, that we get a warped version of what we have now. So not something that is, somehow designed or where people says, now we need democracy 2.0 or 3.0 or something in the age of AI, but that you get something that is rather like a twisted or potentially contorted form of what we have now, but, probably sort of like on the surface in many places continues to look the way it does, but in substance functions very differently.
But then also with AI and democracy, taking a look at how AI is used right now to shape some democratic processes, whether it be elections or, just the general feeling people have towards the systems that are in place. AI collects and analyzes so much data. And my question would be, how much should we be concerned with regards to privacy, surveillance, and this notion of datafication of everyday life? Because my fear is that, we feed AI with so much data that one day it can just predict every move that we have.
So personally, I find that concerning, and I try to minimize also like the data that I share. So I've never had WhatsApp, I've never had Facebook, I've never had Instagram, any of these things, because the underlying business model, which is indeed about data extraction and then monetizing that data, is something that felt completely inimical to my sense of what social media could or should be, right? That, as I said, it's an advertising business. So personally, I'm with you on this. When it comes to the collective side, so like what's the aggregate effect of this, and particularly with respect to democracy? So last year we had all these elections in so many places. In the United States, the European Parliament was newly elected. There were elections in India. Right? I think some people said that maybe half of the human population in principle, or countries that are home to half of the human population, held elections. Yeah. And people felt that this would be sort of like the AI election disaster year. There would be manipulation all over the place, deep fakes, left, right, and center, and nobody knows who's what, where, up and down anymore. Didn't turn out to be the case. In that sense, like it was a lot less extreme than people had feared. So on that front, I feel that that some of the worst fears that people have had with respect to this haven't quite panned out. My bigger worry is, so not so much the direct impact, people using deep fakes to give like weird speeches of Donald Trump or Kamala Harris or something like that. My deeper fear is that in a general climate of disorientation, information overload, also, maybe societal atomization and, just feeling disconnected from many other things, that these indirect effects that AI may have or increasing digitization of society, that feeds unsavory political currents, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that the loss of real human connection that digitization of society fosters, because we order our stuff online, because we have fewer and fewer interactions, because we spend more and more time at home behind our screens rather than hanging out in a bar, in a cafe, or going to a theater show, or just meeting up with friends. Like the loss of social glue that replacing human-human interactions through human-machine interactions generates, for me personally, that's a bigger threat to societal cohesion than deepfakes.
But it's something that is a bit counterintuitive if you think about it, because with the appearance of phones, I can call my parents 1,000 miles away, and you would think that now that we have all of these technologies at our hands, we can spend more time with our friends. But it really is eroding this social element.
So I think that there are two aspects to this. The first one is the one doesn't necessarily, exclude the other. I think you're right to say that there are certain kinds of personal connections that we can foster and create and feed and nourish through digital technologies. And I think the examples that you gave are perfect in that sense. I think at the same time, it can also be true that there are other opportunities for social human-to-human in real life interactions that get squeezed out of our day because they've been replaced either with voluntary human-machine interactions, people watching Netflix, or I don't know, like just looking at stuff on their phone while they're sitting in the metro or something, or also where that's basically been enforced because humans have been taken out of the equation, say at a supermarket cash desk, and now you just like self-scan your stuff and walk out. And for me personally, like it's not just about whether we can, chat with our parents that are a long distance away. I think that's super nice that we can do that, but I'm not sure like how relevant that is for like the more basic societal glue that just keeps people together. There, I feel it is actually important that there are maybe little chats that you have with the person who's sitting at the cash desk in the supermarket, and you maybe actually know that person. And if you just take something like that, I think there are so many levels on which digital technologies have taken that out of the equation, right? Supermarkets have been able to replace corner stores because they have smarter logistics, they have economies of scale that they can leverage, they have business models that are smarter, they can push advertising in a way that no small corner store could. Also, the way that they algorithmically manage their own labor force means that people can be rotated in and out of any cash desk, right? It's no longer the case that somebody sits at the same cash desk for, 20, 30 years. You know that person, they greet you by name, you ask them how the kids are doing, that sort of stuff. Used to be the case some decades ago, not anymore. Well, but now there are even less people sitting there because you have, automated cash out desks, all these things. And in general, stores appear all over the place, certainly like for daily necessities, because people buy stuff online. Right. So on all these different levels, what used to be a very dense social texture that you would have as you would go through your day, as you would go into different shops and just meet the same people and chat with them, and you would know them by name, know their faces, know what's going on. In so many places, that's completely disappeared. And all of these different facets that I just mentioned have to do with digitization. And I think that's a problem that feeds an atomization on a very personal level, that we don't have like these small encounters that keep us together, that I think are very unhealthy for society.
Right. Slowly coming to an end, I want to finish on a hopeful note, something positive. In your opinion, what are the positive sides of AI? Because it's easy to be overwhelmed with all the risks, all the potential dangers that it can carry, and that it carries already. But, what gives you hope about the future of AI?
Well, let me first say something about the positive side, and then we maybe come to the hopes that are out there. So the positive side, for me personally, is I still find the technology pretty amazing. Like, just as a question of human ingenuity, the way that these things function and that they can do it, and, you know, not, as you said, like, I'm not a computer technician, but I think I understand enough of what's going on that it's not difficult to me to become really fascinated, like, from a more scientific nerd kind of view with how these systems function and the different ideas that people have about how you can make them even better. Like, I find that really, really impressive and also enjoyable, considered like as a technological accomplishment.
Yeah, innovation.
I think it's really cool. I'm like, wow, how cool is that?
Do you use AI?
No.
Okay.
I mean, of course, like in some ways we all use it whether we like it or not, but I don't use something like ChatGPT at all. Like really zero.
Because of the data?
No, not so much because of the data. So I think for most of the things, energy consumption is really high. Like it's a lot higher than for your average Google search or something. So like I try in that sense to, like if I need to look something up, I'll try Google first. And there really is, like for me, it makes a difference. I think it's just a pretty wasteful technology right now because inference from these algorithms is so energy intensive. But there's also these things, I mean, I feel, or let me put it this way. I'm not sure that sort of like, you know, strong human characters are built by always using the past of least resistance. So like I try to nurture in myself a basic posture, as it were, you know, that tries sometimes to take the difficult route, so rather than just, you know, looking up something very easily on ChatGPT or having, say, a text that I've written, have it edited or compressed or something by ChatGPT, I still feel that it's important for me to try to hone and preserve these skills myself, and so I'll sit down and spend the much more time than ChatGPT would need to, say, reduce 1,000 words of text to 500 or something. Yeah. But it feels, I don't know, for me...
More rewarding?
I mean, they can be pretty unpleasant work too, because it simply takes like a lot of time. But it feels like it feels like a slippery slope. Like once you say, okay, let me start outsourcing all these things because there's like an easier way to do them with technology. I don't know, like it really leaves me feel a little deflated or something. So I try to, like where I can, like I'm a very analog guy in that sense. I really try to fill my life and my day as much as I can with analog experience. So actually like printing out a text that I've written and then taking my fountain pen and going through editing it line by line. It takes a lot of time, but also does feel very rewarding.
Nice. Yeah. And the question of hope?
The question of hope. There's so many good things that in theory we could do with AI, right? I mean, of course, I guess the go-to field is always things that we could do in healthcare, right? So diagnostics can be vastly improved with AI for all sorts of things. And also when it comes to, for example, you know, helping us find a more sustainable way of interacting with the planet and its resources. Like I'm confident that if we really were to put our minds to it, like AI could absolutely help us with this, right? If this is about, you know, discovering new materials that might be, say, biologically degradable but very stable, something like that, being able to predict weather patterns better, or, you know, helping us use pesticides, you know, in a much more efficient and smart way on our field. I think there are so many good things that you could do with it. So in principle, the potential is there. The question is, how do we get our societies and our politics to a place where we use AI for good and don't do all the other stuff at the same time. So but that's a political thing, right? That's not a technological thing. I think technology is there, but like, how do we strip away, how do we regain the political agency to strip away all the useless and nonsensical and harmful stuff and keep, as I said, like the 20% that I think are really good? If we can do that, it could really, you know, get humanity a step ahead.
So it's 20% that is good.
20, this is the non-mathematician, the non-technical experts are like throwing a number out there, but like in my heart says it's like a 20, 80.
That's good. 20
sort of thing. Okay, yeah, that's you know, getting rid of the 80. That's the hard part.
Yeah. To wrap up, we covered a lot of ground today. If you could leave our listeners with just 3 key takeaways everyone should get about AI, what would they be?
I think the first one is that AI is less important than you think, in the sense that there are many other things that are much more important to the future of our societies and also our democracies and sustainability and feeding the world. So don't think of AI as this potential humanity savior. If humanity doesn't get its act together in principle, AI is not going to do that for us either. And if we do manage to get our act together, like seriously becoming solidaristic with each other or committing to sustainability, then AI can be a nice helper, but like the action is elsewhere. That's number one. Number two is never forget that AI is a set of technologies that is developed by somebody for a particular purpose. It's developed by powerful people, whether they're in government or in companies, with an eye to pursuing their own interests, whether they're to surveil a population, maybe also to help other people, but definitely also to earn money. So this isn't some kind of neutral technology, but it's a tool in the hands of somebody to get stuff done. Whenever you encounter it, ask yourself, like, who is offering me this, to what end? And the final thing then, that's number 3, is that we need to somehow collectively regain some agency over this. So the first one is that I think it's important for us to realize what the different effects are of these technologies in our lives, but then also to taking our own responsibility where we can, and maybe in very small ways, but not only to become AI conscious, but to become AI active. And if, for example, we find that there are algorithms used in apps on our phones, in things in airports or supermarkets or something that we feel are actually not great, then see whether we can come up with ways of not using them, using something else, disabling the cookies that provide the data that feed these algorithms, all these sorts of things. So it's like, become AI conscious and then maybe also become a little bit AI active.
Yeah, funny that you say that, because in preparation for this interview, I was listening some of the interviews that you already gave. I think it was a presentation you gave 3 years ago or 2 years ago, and at the very end you said that we can't just sleepwalk into the AI future, and we need to actively engage and make it part of our public conversation. But then, what does meaningful public engagement with AI actually look like to you? How can we get more people involved in shaping that future?
So I think it begins with the sort of thing that you and I are doing right now, talking about these things and demystifying it, so it's not like this weird ghost in the machine that like does super cool stuff. It's pretty advanced software, and it's a tool that's used. And, say the way that people have conversations about cars and traffic and public transport, and whether, flying around is a good idea or not, and when it's legitimate and when not, and how we could maybe reduce emissions or maybe take the train more often, or people have conversations about whether we should stop flying altogether, and other people say, well, it's not that bad. We can have these conversations. We can have conversations about our food system, how our food is produced, and whether you should eat organic or not, or become vegan or not, right? People have these conversations. I think we could have similar conversations about different aspects of our digital lives as well, right? Do you want to become a digital vegan? Do you become a digital non-flyer? Or say, well, no, pescatarian is good enough, and then that's fine, right? But people have these conversations, and it's, of course, difficult because it's abstract when it comes to digital technologies, but I think there is something that we collectively can do to promote that, and maybe a conversation like ours today is sort of like a little step in that direction.
I hope so. Thank you so much, Professor Mügge, for joining us today. And to our listeners, don't forget to check out roomfordiscussion.com for more upcoming interviews and podcasts. This was Ivory Tower. I'm Tadej, and we'll be back soon to make complex topics easier to understand. See you next time.
Yeah, thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you.